The projector screen in the hotel conference room still had my name on the deck. When Victor Kane stood up and told the room I had falsified the client numbers, I was standing 3 feet away from him, coffee in hand, and I watched him point at my own slide, the one I had built at 2 in the morning, and call it fraud. Nobody in that room from Chicago knew me well enough to argue. Victor had flown them in himself, booked their flights, chosen the hotel, arranged the whole 2-day agenda without once mentioning to me that Friday morning would open with an accusation instead of the quarterly pitch we'd rehearsed together. He said it slow, like he wanted every syllable to land, that the projections I submitted for the Meridian account were inflated to make myself look better before the partnership vote next quarter. I set my coffee down because my hand had started to shake, and I didn't want anyone to see that. Victor kept going, saying he'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, saying he'd trusted me for 6 years, and it hurt him to say this out loud. And the whole time, he wouldn't look at me, only at the investors from Chicago who had flown in on the company's dime to decide whether Kane and Reeves Consulting was worth a second round of funding. He said the word disappointed twice, slow both times, like he was performing grief for an audience that had never met me before that morning. I said his name once, quiet, just Victor. And he finally turned and gave me a look like I was a stranger who'd wandered into his meeting. Someone near the window shifted in their chair. Nobody said a word in my defense, because nobody there had any reason to. Priya Anand, the older of the two Chicago investors, asked what specifically was inflated, and Victor pulled up a slide of his own, one I'd never seen before, with numbers that didn't match anything I remembered submitting. I asked where those figures came from, and Victor said calmly that he'd have his assistant pull the source documentation later, that he didn't want to derail the meeting further. I said that sounded convenient, and he said the same thing back to me, only sharper, like he'd been waiting for me to give him an opening. The room felt smaller with every sentence. My phone was in my pocket, and I remember thinking I should just pull up the real emails right there, but some old habit of trusting him, even in that moment, made me hold back and wait for a fair chance to speak instead of turning it into a shouting match in front of strangers holding our future in their hands. We built this firm out of a garage apartment 9 years ago, back when neither of us could afford real chairs, and we took client calls sitting on overturned crates because the folding chairs kept collapsing under us. For a long time, I believed the partnership meant something. I remembered the year his daughter was born, and I covered every client call for 6 weeks without complaint, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night so he could be home with his wife and the baby. I remembered driving him to the hospital myself when his father had the stroke, sitting in that waiting room with him until 4 in the morning, buying him vending machine coffee because neither of us trusted ourselves to drive home. I remembered handing him half of every bonus I earned in our second year because his bank account had gone dry and mine hadn't, and he'd promised, sitting right across from me at a diner table at 2 in the morning, that he'd never forget it, that I'd covered him when it counted, and he'd carry that the rest of his life. I remembered the two of us signing the lease on our first real office, both of us too broke to afford the deposit alone, splitting it down to the dollar because that's what partners did. I remember the time Victor's marriage nearly fell apart in our 4th year, and I told every client who called that week he was traveling, covering for him so he could sit at home and work things out with his wife, instead of losing both his family and the firm at once. I never told him I'd done that until years later, and when I finally mentioned it in passing, he'd gone quiet, and said he owed me more than he could ever repay. None of that mattered in that conference room in Denver. What mattered was that Victor had found out 3 days earlier through a slipped comment from my old college roommate that I had quietly closed a private investment partnership with a hedge fund called Bellhaven Capital, a deal that would let me buy him out of the firm entirely if I chose to. Nobody else knew that. I hadn't even told my wife the full number yet. But Victor knew, and instead of asking me about it like a partner, he decided to burn me down first, in front of the people whose money decided our future. So the buyout would never happen, and the story would always be that I was the one who lied. The investors from Chicago, a woman named Priya Anand and a man named Roger Doyle, exchanged a look, and Roger asked if there was any documentation to support the fraud claim. Victor said he was compiling it, that these things take time, that he hadn't wanted to blindside anyone but felt an obligation to be honest before real money changed hands. I asked to speak, and Victor said, "Sure, go ahead, defend yourself," like he was doing me a favor. I said the Meridian numbers came straight from Meridian's own finance department, forwarded to me directly, and that I still had the email chain if anyone wanted to see it. Victor smiled the way he used to smile when he'd already won an argument before it started, and said convenient that I'd have that ready. And the room laughed a little, not because it was funny, but because they didn't know what else to do with the tension. I said nothing else. I left the meeting and drove straight to the office, hands still gripping the wheel tighter than the road required. And I sat at my desk until nearly midnight, going through 9 years of shared files, timestamps, forwarded threads, anything that would show what actually happened. The office was empty except for the hum of the server room down the hall. And every so often I'd stop and just stare at the screen, still not fully believing a man I'd trusted with my worst years had just tried to end my career in front of strangers. Somewhere around 11, my phone buzzed with a text from my wife Elena asking if I was okay, and I realized I hadn't told her anything yet because I still couldn't believe he'd done it. I typed out 3 different replies before settling on something short, telling her I'd explain everything when I got home, and she wrote back a single line, "Whatever it is, we'll handle it," which was the first thing all day that made my chest loosen even slightly. What Victor didn't know, what nobody at that firm knew yet, was that 3 weeks earlier, I had quietly signed paperwork with a hedge fund called Bellhaven Capital, a private investment partnership that valued my share of the firm at nearly triple what Victor thought it was worth, enough that I could buy him out entirely if I decided to use it. I'd kept it quiet because I hadn't decided what kind of partner I wanted to be if I did pull that trigger, and some small, stubborn part of me still hoped we could fix things without it ever coming into play. Around that same time, my old college roommate Danny called me out of nowhere, apologizing for something I didn't understand at first. He said he'd run into Victor at a conference in Austin, and not knowing any of what had happened, mentioned offhand that he'd heard through a mutual friend at Bellhaven that I'd closed a major deal recently. He said Victor had gone quiet on the phone after that, then changed the subject fast, asking a couple of clipped questions about the deal size before steering the conversation somewhere else entirely. Danny said he hadn't thought much of it at the time, figuring it was just Victor being Victor, distracted and a little competitive the way he always got around money talk. But once Danny heard secondhand what had happened in Denver, He couldn't shake the feeling that the timing wasn't a coincidence. I hung up and sat with that for a long minute because it meant Victor hadn't stumbled onto some accounting error at all. He'd found out I had leverage over him, and instead of picking up the phone and asking me about it like a partner would, he decided to strike first and make sure the story was already written before I got the chance to tell it myself. It explained the timing, the Chicago trip he'd planned without me, the sudden urgency. I didn't call him about it. I just kept building my case, quietly, the same way he'd built his. 2 weeks later, Victor organized what he called a reconciliation dinner, booked out the private room at the steakhouse downtown where we used to celebrate closed deals together, invited half the office, the Chicago investors, even a reporter from a regional business journal he'd been courting for months, telling everyone it was a chance to move forward as a firm after a difficult stretch. I almost didn't go. Elena told me I should, that walking away would only make it look like I had something to hide. So I put on a suit and sat near the middle of the long table and watched Victor work the room like a man already certain of the outcome. Halfway through the entrees, he tapped his glass with a fork and stood up, said a few warm words about the firm's history, thanked the investors for their patience, and then said the firm was moving forward with a new leadership structure, one that didn't include, in his words, people who inflate numbers to protect their own equity. He raised his glass like he was already celebrating, and a few people around the table raised theirs too, out of habit more than agreement. That was when Melissa Ortiz, our junior analyst, stood up from the back of the room, visibly uncomfortable, and said she thought everyone should know that Nathan had recently closed an outside investment deal, a partnership with Bellhaven Capital worth more than the entire firm's current valuation, and that maybe that context mattered before anyone signed anything. The room went quiet in a different way now. Victor's face changed color, and he said, too fast, that this was exactly the kind of secretive behavior he'd been trying to warn everyone about, proof that I'd been planning to push him out all along. I stood up and said that was true. I had made the deal, and I hadn't announced it because I hadn't decided what to do with it yet. But since we were airing things out, I had something else worth sharing. I pulled out my phone and read the room the first piece, an email from Meridian's own finance director, dated 6 weeks earlier, laying out the exact projections Victor had called fraudulent. Victor said it proved nothing on its own, that anyone could receive an email. So I read the second piece, his own reply to that email, thanking Meridian for the clarity and forwarding it internally the same afternoon, meaning he'd read the real numbers with his own eyes before he ever stood up in Denver. The room went a little colder at that. Victor said he must have misread it in passing, that he'd been slammed that week and skimmed too fast. And Roger asked, evenly, whether skimming explained why he typed a full paragraph thanking the client for the detail. Then I read the third piece, a message Victor had sent to our office manager 2 days before the Denver trip, asking her to pull any file that might make me, in his words, look less credible before the funding vote. Priya asked to see all 3 messages directly, and I forwarded the whole chain to her phone right there at the table so she could read it herself instead of taking my word for it. Victor said this was being twisted, that context was missing, but the office manager, sitting near the far end of the table, said quietly that she remembered the message clearly because it had made her uncomfortable at the time. 2 more people, an account manager and one of the junior associates, said Victor had approached them with similar requests in the weeks before the trip. The reporter was still there, taking notes on all of it, and I watched Victor realize in real time that the story he'd spent months building had just flipped completely onto him. Priya set her phone down on the table, looked at Victor for a long moment, and said she'd need to reconsider everything about the funding round before the firm saw another dollar from Bellhaven. Roger leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and asked Victor directly whether there was anything else the room should know before they wasted any more of their evening. Victor didn't answer. He just sat there, jaw tight, while the table that had raised their glasses to him an hour earlier now avoided his eyes one by one. The way people do when they've realized they backed the wrong person and don't want to be the next one asked to explain themselves. The fallout moved fast after that. Bellhaven pulled its support for any deal that kept Victor in a leadership role, telling Priya plainly that they didn't fund people who manufactured fraud accusations to protect their own equity. Within a month, the firm's board, the very board Victor had personally recruited 2 years earlier, believing they'd always side with him, voted to remove him as managing partner pending a formal review. 2 clients he'd been quietly courting for himself, hoping to take them with him if he ever split from the firm, walked away entirely once the Regional Business Journal ran a short piece on the internal dispute, neither one wanting their name near the story. A consulting association he sat on the board of quietly asked him to step down before his term was up, citing conduct concerns nobody would specify out loud. His name came off the letterhead by the end of the quarter, and by the following spring, 2 separate firms that had once courted him for a leadership role stopped returning his calls once his name came up in a background check. His college fraternity, where he'd sat on an alumni advisory board for years, quietly removed his bio from their website without ever making an announcement. Even a local business podcast that had booked him months earlier for an episode on partnership and trust canceled the recording 2 days before it was scheduled to air, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone in the industry understood weren't really about scheduling at all. He came to my house on a Sunday afternoon, stood on the porch looking smaller than I remembered him ever looking, hands shoved in his jacket pockets like he didn't know what else to do with them, and said he was sorry, that he'd panicked when he found out about Bellhaven, that 9 years should have counted for more than one bad month. He said he kept replaying that morning in Denver, wishing he just called me instead, and that he didn't expect anything from me by saying it. He just needed to say it out loud to my face at least once. I told him I believed he was sorry, and that being sorry didn't undo the 6 weeks I'd spent watching people who used to respect me decide whether to believe a lie. I told him I still wasn't going to give him his name back on the door. Not now, maybe not ever. He nodded like he'd expected that answer, said he understood, and walked back to his car without saying anything else. And I watched him go without feeling the satisfaction I thought I might feel. Just a tired sort of quiet that settled somewhere behind my ribs. I stood on the porch a while longer after his car pulled away, watching the street go still again, thinking about how strange it was that the ending to 9 years could look this small. No shouting, no last word, just a man walking to his car in the afternoon light. That evening, Elena and I sat on the back steps with our daughter running around the yard chasing fireflies, her laugh carrying across the grass every time she caught one in her cupped hands and immediately let it go again. And Elena asked if I felt good about how it ended. I told her I felt something more like relief than victory, quieter than I expected, and that was fine with me. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said maybe quiet was exactly what 9 years of noise deserved to end in. The unexpected part came a week later when Bellhaven's lead partner called to say the new valuation, now that Victor was gone and the firm's name was clean again, made them want to move faster than originally planned, folding my firm into a larger portfolio company within the year, instead of the slower 3-year timeline we'd first discussed. It meant trading full independence for serious resources, a bigger team, and a board I'd have to answer to on decisions I used to make alone at my own desk at midnight. It wasn't the outcome I'd pictured when I signed that deal in secret months earlier, sitting alone in a lawyer's office, not even sure I'd ever use it. I sat with the news for exactly one night, turning it over while Elena slept beside me, before deciding it was a problem worth having. The kind of problem that meant the firm I'd fought for was actually going to be worth something. I called Priya back the next morning and told her I was in, on my terms, with Melissa promoted to full partner alongside me. The same Melissa who'd stood up in that dinner room when nobody else would. If you've ever trusted someone for 9 years only to watch them try to burn it all down over one bad month, you already know the moment you stop needing their apology is the moment you actually win. If this story hit home for you, hit like and subscribe, because there's another one coming next week.